Alexander III of Macedon, better known as Alexander the Great, July 21, 356 BCE, 10 or June 11, 323 BCE, or 336 to 323 BCE, was the son of King Philip II of Macedon, or 359 to 336 BCE, who became king upon his father's death in 336 BCE and then conquered most of the known world of his day. He is known as the Great both for his military genius and his diplomatic skills in handling the various populaces of the regions he conquered. He is further recognized for spreading Greek culture, language, and thought from Greece throughout Asia Minor, Egypt, and Mesopotamia to India, and thus initiating the era of the Hellenistic period, 323 to 31 BCE, during which four of his generals, his successors, known as the Diadochi, in between their wars for supremacy, continued his policies of integrating Greek culture with that of the Near East. He died of unknown causes in 323 BCE without clearly naming a successor, and the empire he built was divided among the Diadochi. Alexander's campaigns became legendary after his death, influencing the tactics and careers of later Greek and Roman generals, as well as inspiring numerous biographies attributing to him a godlike status. Modern-day historians have generally taken a more critical approach to his life and career than earlier accounts, as evidenced by criticism of his destruction of Persepolis and treatment of the citizens of Tyre, but the general consensus regarding his legacy among Western scholars, anyway, remains largely positive, and he remains one of the most popular and recognizable figures in world history. Alexander's youth. When Alexander was young, he was taught to fight and ride by Leonidas of Epirus, a relative of his mother Olympias, as well as to endure hardships such as forced marches. His father, Philip, was interested in cultivating a refined future king, and so hired Lysimachus of Acarnania to teach the boy reading, writing, and to play the lyre. This tutelage would instill in Alexander a lifelong love of reading and music. At the age of 13 or 14, Alexander was introduced to the Greek philosopher Aristotle, 384 to 322 BCE, whom Philip hired as a private tutor. He would study with Aristotle until the age of 16, and the two are said to have remained in correspondence throughout Alexander's later campaigns, although evidence of this is anecdotal. Aristotle's influence directly bore upon Alexander's later dealings with the people he conquered, in that Alexander never forced the culture of Greece upon the inhabitants of the various regions but merely introduced it in the same way Aristotle used to teach his students. The influence of Leonidas may be seen in Alexander's lifelong resilience and physical stamina, as well as in his skill with horses. Alexander is said to have tamed the untamable Bucephalus when he was only 11 or 12 years old. While his various tutors' influences certainly had a profound effect upon him, Alexander seemed destined for greatness from birth. He had, first of all, a father whose accomplishments laid a firm foundation for his later success. While it is clear that his father had a great impact on him, Alexander himself chose to see his success as ordained by divine forces. He called himself the son of Zeus, and so claimed the status of a demigod, linking his bloodline to his two favorite heroes of antiquity, Achilles and Hercules, and modeling his behavior after theirs. This belief in his divinity was instilled in him by Olympias, who also told him that his was a virgin birth, as she had been miraculously impregnated by Zeus himself. His birth was associated with great signs and wonders, such as a bright star gleaming over Macedonia that night and the destruction of the temple of Artemis at Ephesus. Though his birth is well documented by historians, there is little information on his youth. Aside from tales of his precociousness, he allegedly interviewed visiting dignitaries about the boundaries and strengths of Persia when he was 7 years old, his tutors, and his childhood friends. Alexander's friends Cassander, LC 355 to 297 BCE, Ptolemy, LC 367 to 282 BCE, and Hephaestion, LC 356 to 324 BCE, would become his lifelong companions and generals in his army. Chaeronea and the early campaigns. Alexander's military prowess was first noted at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE. Although only 18 years old, he helped turn the tide of battle in the decisive Macedonian victory which defeated the Greek allied city-states. When Philip II was assassinated in 336 BCE, Alexander assumed the throne, and with the Greek city-states now united under Macedonian rule following Chaeronea, embarked on the great campaign his father had been planning, the conquest of the mighty Persian Empire. With a Macedonian army of 32,000 infantry and 5,100 cavalry, Alexander crossed over to Asia Minor in 334 BCE to begin his conquest of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, defeating the Persian army led by satraps at the Battle of Granicus in May. He then liberated, as he phrased his conquest, the cities of Sardis and Ephesus from Persian rule that same year before moving on to others in Asia Minor. At Ephesus, he offered to rebuild the Temple of Artemis, which had been destroyed by arson on the night of his birth, but the city refused his gesture. In 333 BCE, Alexander and his troops defeated the larger force of King Darius III, or 336 to 330 BCE, of Persia at the Battle of Issos. Alexander went on to sack the Phoenician cities of Baalbek and Sidon, which had surrendered, in 332 BCE and then lay siege to the island city of Tyre. So determined was he to conquer the ancient city of Tyre that he built a causeway from the mainland to the island on which to mount his siege engines. This causeway, in time, collected silt and earth and is the reason why Tyre is a part of the mainland in Lebanon today. For their stubborn resistance, the inhabitants of the city were slaughtered and the survivors sold into slavery. His policy regarding the citizens of Tyre is cited by historians, ancient and modern, as a prime example of his ruthlessness. In 331 BCE, he conquered Egypt where he founded the city of Alexandria. At the Oracle of Siwa, in the eponymous Egyptian oasis, he was proclaimed a son of the god Zeus Ammon. The Persian campaigns. In 331 BCE, Alexander met King Darius III again on the battlefield at Gaugamela, also called the Battle of Arbela, where, once again facing overwhelming numbers, he decisively defeated Darius III who fled the field. Alexander then moved on to take Babylon and Susa which surrendered unconditionally without resistance. In the winter of 330, Alexander marched toward Persepolis, meeting resistance at the Battle of the Persian Gates defended by the hero Ariobarzanes, L. 386 to 330 BCE, and his sister Utab Ariobarzan, D. 330 BCE, at the head of the Persian troops. Alexander defeated this force and took Persepolis, which he then burned. According to the ancient historian Diodorus Siculus, and other ancient sources, he started the fire which destroyed the main palace and most of the city as revenge for the burning of the Acropolis in Xerxes' Persian invasion of Greece in 480 BCE. This act was said to be instigated during a drunken party by Thais, the Athenian lover of the general Ptolemy, claiming it would be apt revenge for the city to be burnt by women's hands, and she is said to have thrown her torch right after Alexander threw the first. In the summer of 330 BCE, Darius III was assassinated by his own general and cousin Bessus, an act which Alexander was said to deplore. Darius III's corpse was treated with the greatest respect, as were the surviving members of his family. Alexander proclaimed himself the king of Asia and continued on with his conquest, marching into the region of modern-day Afghanistan. In 329 BCE, he founded the city of Alexandria Escate on the Iaxartes River, destroyed the city of Syropolis, and defeated the Scythians at the northern borders of the empire. Between fall of 330 BCE and spring of 327 BCE, he campaigned against Bactria and Sogdiana, hard-fought battles which he won as he had every engagement thus far. Bessus was captured and executed for his treachery against his former king to send the message that disloyalty of that kind would never be rewarded. Alexander founded many cities bearing his name during this time to further his public image not only as a liberator but as a god, and adopted the title Shahanshah, King of Kings, used by the rulers of the First Persian Empire. In keeping with this status, Alexander introduced the Persian custom of proskynesis to the army, forcing those who addressed him to first kneel and kiss his hand. The Macedonian troops became progressively uncomfortable with Alexander's apparent deification and adoption of Persian customs. Assassination plots were hatched, notably in 327 BCE, only to be revealed and the conspirators executed, even if they were old friends. Callisthenes became one of these when he was implicated in a plot. Clitus, the elder statesman who had saved Alexander's life at the Battle of Granicus, would doom himself in a similar way. India and mutiny. In 327 BCE, with the Persian Empire firmly under his control and newly married to the Bactrian noblewoman Roxana, c. 340 to c. 310 BCE, Alexander turned his attention to India. Having heard of the exploits of the great Macedonian general, the Indian king Omphis of Taxila submitted to his authority without a fight, but the Aspagioi and Assakinoi tribes strongly resisted. In battles throughout 327 BCE and into 326 BCE, Alexander subdued these tribes, finally meeting King Porus of Parava at the Battle of the Hydaspes River in 326 BCE. Porus charged Alexander's forces with elephants and fought so bravely with his troops that, after defeating Porus, Alexander installed him as ruler of a larger region than he had previously held. Alexander's horse Bucephalus was killed in this battle, and Alexander named one of the two cities he founded after the battle, Bucephala, after him. Alexander intended to march on and cross the river Ganges toward further conquests, but his troops, worn out by the hard-fought battle with Porus, in which, according to Arrian, Alexander lost 1,000 men, mutinied in 326 BCE and refused to go further. Alexander tried to persuade his men to press on but, failing to win them over, finally assented to their wishes. He split his army in two, sending half back to Susa by sea under the command of Admiral Nearchus through the Persian Gulf, and marching the other half on through the Gedrosian Desert in 325 BCE, almost a full year after his troops had mutinied. His reasoning behind this decision, both the delay in withdrawal after the mutiny and the form it finally took, is still unclear and debated by historians. Even though he had abandoned his conquest of India, he still paused on his march to subdue those hostile tribes he encountered along the way. The harsh terrain of the desert, and the military engagements, took a great toll on his troops, and by the time they reached Susa in 324 BCE, Alexander had sustained considerable losses. Upon his return, he found that many of the satraps he had entrusted with rule had abused their power and so executed them, as well as those who had vandalized the tomb of Cyrus the Great, c. 550 to 530 BCE, at the old capital city of Pasargadae. He ordered the ancient capital and tomb to be restored and took other measures to integrate his army with the people of the region and merge the cultures of Persia and Macedonia. Alexander's death. While still processing the grief of Hephaestion's death, Alexander returned to Babylon in 323 BCE with plans for expanding his empire, but he would never realize them. He died at Babylon at the age of 32 on 10 or June 11, 323 BCE after suffering 10 days of high fever. Theories concerning his cause of death have ranged from poisoning to malaria to meningitis to bacterial infection from drinking contaminated water, among others. Plutarch says that, 14 days before his death, Alexander entertained his fleet admiral Nearchus and his friend Medius of Larissa with a long bout of drinking, after which he fell into a fever from which he never recovered. When he was asked who should succeed him, Alexander said, "The strongest," which answer led to his empire being divided between four of his generals, Cassander, Ptolemy, Antigonus, and Seleucus, known as the Diadochi or successors.